Welcome everyone to the latest in Bright Blue's Ludgate Lecture series, so named after our former office in Ludgate Circus. With the government having released a new white paper on English devolution in late last year, we're delighted to be joined by Sir Paul Collier to discuss this. He may need no introduction, but for those of you who don't know, he's the Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, as well as being co-director of the International Growth Centre at the LSE. Also, particular relevance today, he's written many books, but the most recent one is Left Behind, A New Economics and Neglected Papers, which, like the white paper, came out last year. So the way it's going to work is that Sir Paul is going to speak for about 20 minutes, then we're going to have a bit of Q&A. I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up. You'll see that there's a Slido link under the video. Please submit your questions. The more questions, the less you have to hear questions from me. Because this will sort of may cut off rather abruptly at the hour mark, in case I don't get to say this at the end, thank you so much to Sir Paul for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you this afternoon. And that's enough from me, so I will hand over to Paul. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much. The true devolution, I give this lecture all around the world, but in England, it's necessary to say true devolution doesn't look like Scotland under the SNP or Wales under Welsh Labour, right? We could go into a long detour on why they're not the models that I have in mind at all, and how exceptional they are. So what it is about a transfer of agency to be closer to ordinary citizens. That's what the sense of devolution is. In Britain, it means from a totally exceptional concentration of agency in Treasury civil servants. Not really in politicians, but in civil servants in the Treasury who completely dominate public decision-taking. And that is absolutely unique. It's really unique to England, because a little bit of agency has been given to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, which they've, for various complicated reasons, they've used very badly. Left Behind, the book, and I've realized what I've got here is the American edition, not the British, but anyway, the Left Behind is based on 6 premises that I've come gradually and painfully to understand over a very long life, which has been partly a successful academic, and partly a practitioner working first with the World Bank, but more recently advising a lot of local governments in Britain and governments really around the world. So what are these 6 things that I think I've come to know? And I didn't come to know, I didn't know 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, some of them. So 2 are about our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. What we know about Homo sapiens sapiens is that we are the most pro-social of all the mammal species by a mile. We're just astonishingly more pro-social than anything, even on the genetic tree that's the closest thing to us. We're brilliant at cooperating, and we're brilliant at learning fast from each other in a network group. We're very good at copying success. if you like, that's part of the secret of our success as a species. We know, and this is quite not widely understood, we know that our behavior is guided by the collective mind of our network group, much more than by individual rational decision taking. My own discipline of economics has got stuck with a completely misleading account of the evolutionary furnace through which we've emerged, and my economists have sort of built in a model of individual rationality as the basis for decision taking, which just isn't true. Most of our decisions, some estimates about 80%, are taken by the collective mind of our network group. And there are good reasons for that. Our collective mind of our network group has accumulated a lot of history, a lot of eyes and ears that seen a lot more of the world than one individual. Our own rational thought, our prefrontal cortex doesn't get finished until the age of 24, which casts some light. The last part of our brain to get sorted out is the brain that estimates risk behavior, which sort of puts a little negative gloss on the need to push the age of voting down to 16 or whatever. What else do we know about human nature? We know that we're not designed to be saints. That is, we don't love everybody anywhere in the future equally with ourselves or our kids. We also, so that sort of model of saintliness is a crazy model. We know that we're influenced by role models, both for good or for bad. With a good role model, that can raise our behavior up, though not to sainthood, usually. Bad role models can drag us down to behave really like greedy, lazy shits. That being a technical economic term, forgive me. What else do we know? We know that about humans, we know that trust, agency, and mutuality all matter. If we compare societies that have all these features, people trust each other, they trust the government, they have agency themselves, they've got powers themselves, and they have built systems of mutuality in which fellow citizens know they have to help them, and that you likewise can expect to be helped by your fellow citizens. So trust, agency, and mutuality, societies with those features really work very well, certainly very much better than societies which have none of those features. If you like, a society which has all these features, Denmark, comes out in the top 3 of almost anything that gets rated in terms of human well-being, health, longevity, children's levels of stress, and all sorts of things. Very much better than societies which have none of those features, which it would be unfair to name. And then we know a few things about governance. We know that subsidiarity in governance tends to be a good idea. Subsidiarity is something that the British government was very keen on preaching to other members of the European Union when we were in it. If you remember, subsidiarity. And that was the principle that you should devolve to the lowest level of organization at which an objective can be achieved. Because at a lower level, it's much, much easier to get it implemented. Now, for many economic policy matters, if you devolve to two units that are just tiny, the span of control and cooperation within the unit is just too small to reap economies of scale. And so there's a trade-off between the bigger the group is, the more scale economies you get, and the smaller the group is, the closer you get to being able to implement things. And the best guess we can have for a sensible economic size for many economic decisions is at European income levels, populations of between about 5 and 7 or 8 million, that sort of thing. Let's say 5 to 10. In practical terms, think the Scandinavians typically are around that, the Baltics are around that, if a bit smaller. The Landers in Germany, which has very devolved system of governance. The Landers, the average size of Landers, there's a lot of variation, but the average size is about 7 million, something like that, 5 to 7 million. What are we? I'll in a moment pull the implications for the level at which we should devolve in Britain. But clearly, Britain as a whole is too big, way too big for that. What else do we know? We know that planning horizons for investment decisions should be something in the range 5 to 10 years. That applies to infrastructure and how we finance it, and the training of a workforce, because the skill level of a workforce reflects training. We've been obsessed for many years, goes back to mass unemployment in 1931. We've been obsessed by getting people into work, and in the process have built systems which utterly fail to enable people to and encourage people to accumulate skills in the job. So planning horizons 5 to 10 years for planning for skills, planning for infrastructure. So two other things we know. We know that the future is subject to radical uncertainty, and radical uncertainty includes the concept of unknowability. Many things are just unknowable. I've got teenagers, right? Many of you probably got teenagers. It's pretty unknowable what strategy of parenting will enable those teenagers to reach their full flourishing potential in life. And that doesn't just mean earn as much money as possible. It can mean feeling satisfied that what you're doing is worthwhile. At the larger level, President Trump has clearly specialized in producing complete unpredictability. And I think that's partly that he himself is able to move fast, break things, and pounce on the opportunities that result from them. He's used to being a solo operator, owning his own enterprise, and so able to move fast, be very unpredictable, um, and pounce on opportunities. So that's sort of radical uncertainty. Um, how do we cope with living in a world of radical uncertainty? And the answer is we need to design governance so that we learn rapidly. And to learn rapidly, we need to have experiments going on in parallel, and then learning from the network group in which those experiments happen. And finally, we know that transitions from very bad states to very good states like Denmark are really hard, because you don't start with the properties that Denmark has: high levels of trust, high levels of cooperation, high levels of mutuality. So finally, let me bring this down to reforming Britain's governance. And the Treasury, civil servants in the Treasury and senior civil servants in the Treasury at the moment have far too much power of decision. It's particularly dangerous because the Treasury is quite obsessively short-termist. So it doesn't think 5 years ahead or 10 years. It barely thinks 1 year ahead. Its basic function as a treasury is the annual budget and the desperate scramble to get revenues to increase, to match the pressures of spending. That's been the game since Gladstone. And so Treasury officials think of themselves as a rather heroic little band that is trying to empower the Chancellor of the Exchequer against everybody else. Who's everybody else? Mainly the other evil ministries in Whitehall, who have a minister in the cabinet and are there to spend taxpayers' hard-earned money. And then somewhere out there in the wild beyond, north of the inner circular, there are things called local governments, which are even worse than the spending ministries. And so the Treasury's whole instinct is to save money and retain control over the spending ministries and over local government. That retention of control and desperate short-termism has doomed us to failure after failure after failure. If you just want me to it's painful to remind you because I'm reminding myself, but think of HS2, which continues to get crazier by the day. How on earth did we stumble into HS2? We didn't stumble into it. It's the Treasury. It's the Treasury that took all the decisions on HS2. Of course, it will deny it. It will say no. They were handled by the Ministry of Transport. Well, if you ask the Ministry of Transport, it will say all our decisions are completely micromanaged by the Treasury. The Ministry of Transport's no power. So that's the bitter reality. What do we need to change that? The Treasury will not change itself. That is for sure. It's hardwired into a culture that goes back right to Gladstone. There's no way that the Treasury will self-rectify. It will fight any loss of control every inch of the way. And the reason is that it has a misdiagnosis of astonishing proportions, a misdiagnosis for why Britain isn't working very well, which you'll probably have noticed it isn't. Why is Britain not working very well? And the Treasury's diagnosis is because we, the Treasury, don't have enough control. And so over the last 30 years, there has been a systematic retreat from the tiny little bits of devolution we've had. There's been a retreat from autonomy of an empowerment of other Whitehall ministries. Everything is now micromanaged in Whitehall, and there's in Treasury, and there's been a retreat from funding of local government. So local government has got less and less and less budget, less and less and less powers. What will now happen is that when it's suggested to the Treasury that it should devolve, what it will do is devolve a few responsibilities to anybody else who's willing to take them. It will devolve to the things like the Ministry of Transport. It will devolve to public agencies, regulatory agencies. It will devolve to the housing stuff. It will devolve to Homes England, it's a public agency. To local government, it will devolve the responsibility for all the statutory obligations that it's loaded onto local authorities. As a result, local authorities will go bankrupt, and the Treasury will say, that's nothing to do with us, they're just mismanaged. As of course, some of them are. Right? Why are they mismanaged? Because they have so little power that it's never been worth building the skills to take long-term planning decisions for a region. So here's a suggestion that Whitehall and the Treasury will absolutely loathe. But I think it would be a very wise thing to do. In about a month, I'd be invited, now that I've made a fuss on social media, I've been invited by the head of the Government Economic Service, who's, of course, a Treasury official. She's invited me to speak about Left Behind to the Government Economic Service, which I did about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the Government Economic Service was 2,500 people. Now it's 3,500 people. Why has it grown by so much? Because we need more senior civil servants, especially in the Treasury, in order to scrutinize what is happening in the other ministries and in local government. That's why we've staffed up. That's why the Government Economic Service is inflated. So here's what I'm going to suggest to the Government Economic Service. It's that they should be, first of all, more inclusive. Of course, inclusive is a very comic word because it means so many different things to different people. But I'm going to suggest one dimension of inclusivity that I think the Government Economic Service really should embrace, and that is to say, it should include professional economists working in local government, as well as the professional economists working in the Treasury and the and Whitehall. At the moment, it just includes the Treasury and the rest of Whitehall economists. But if it included local government, that would be more inclusive. We could all agree on that word. What would we then do? We'd then introduce a little condition, which is that a condition for further promotion within Whitehall would be that members of the Government Economic Service should have a certain period of years working in local government. We wouldn't need to do any extra spending. We would merely transfer some of the enormous caliber of people used at the moment to scrutinize local government to actually build some capacity in local government. And let me close with one thing that is currently being discussed, which is that each region has been instructed by Whitehall to come up with a growth plan. And they have to show how their growth plan is compatible with the national growth plan that has been announced or shortly will be announced when Rachel Reeves gets round to it. How will your growth plan be compatible with the national growth plan? And they've, of course, been given about 3 weeks to do it, design a regional growth plan. Andy Burnham, City Region Authority Mayor for Greater Manchester, has really pushed back on that very sensibly. He said, first of all, we've been working on a regional growth plan for the last 10 years. It's built on a vast base of data that goes back 30 years to a very fine local official called Howard Bernstein, who built a magnificent local government capacity in Manchester. And so Burnham said, we've got a growth plan which works for Greater Manchester. Whether it's going to be compatible with whatever you come up with at the national level, I have no idea, nor do I really care. Because my job as mayor is to be accountable to the citizens of Greater Manchester, not to be accountable to the Treasury. And that seems to me right. We need to encourage accountability, not to the Treasury, but to voters and citizens in the localities. On that note, Will, let me hand back to you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Paul. That was really interesting. I'll sort of kick off with, I guess, a few questions of my own, and I guess starting with the bogeyman of the peace treasury. So you've talked about sort of including some more local government officials within it. What do you make? Do you think other changes need to be made? Do you think it needs to perhaps be the idea of has been discussed many times of breaking it up so that it doesn't have the institutional reach to middle across Whitehall, or do you think some reduction in its numbers so that it doesn't have the capacity and it has to be more selective in what it micromanages?
It has to stick to its knitting. The only thing it knows about is the annual budget, and that's quite enough for it. Right? We need to split half the Treasury off and put it into an economics ministry. Every other OEC government has an economics ministry tasked with longer-term economic planning. It's no good trying to get the Treasury to plan longer than 1 year ahead. It doesn't believe in it. It doesn't believe in place-based plan. It doesn't even believe in place-based economies, right? So it's useless trying to get the Treasury to do things. It's completely against its skill set. It's completely against its culture. It's against the beliefs of the senior people there. So you have to smash it, I'm afraid. Um, and the only way we can smash it is by having a very senior minister, at least of the same rank as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, um, who will head it um, and be charged with um, long-term economic planning and will have equal voice, a veto on all economic plans, so that the Treasury can't just go ahead and announce the budget. The budget has to be compatible with the long-term plan. A very salient example is skills. I mean, this is crazy, but do you realize that the National Health Service now only trains 40% of the doctors that we need each year to fill it? How have we come to such a stupid thing to do? We're recruiting from third world trained doctors. If you have got a kid who wants to become a doctor, their best bet is to get dual citizenship of some third world country, go to the university there or to a medical school or something, get trained, and then come back to Britain. It's a crazy system. It's a disgrace, but it's one of a thousand examples of a total failure of vocational training. And the Treasury has presided over that. It's even proud of it. It thinks it saved money. So we need an economics ministry. Until we've got one that has veto power over the budget, forget it.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. So since you've talked a bit about skills in sort of other contexts, what role do you envisage local government as having? Because obviously, like historically, a lot of the universities, sort of the red brick universities, were set up to fill local skill shortages or service local industries. Would you like to see local authorities and of whatever size going back into that? And
Of course,
yeah,
that was what I'm from Sheffield, now poorest city in England. Sheffield University, which is a top 100 research university in the world, just think what that means, right? There it is, a fantastic resource. It was founded in 1904 by a levy, a voluntary deal between the trades unions in the steel industry and the biggest steel baron. And it was a system of matched funding. Every pound that the workforce contributed was matched by the steel baron. And that became the endowment for Sheffield University. As far as we can see, it was an entirely voluntary levy. As far as we can see, every steel worker paid it. And that was because at the time, Sheffield believed in mutuality, trust, all the rest of these are desirable things. And so Sheffield was a proud network community of social responsibility and produced the endowment which founded Sheffield University. The people, like my grandparents, who financed that, why did they want education? They hadn't had any themselves. My own parents left school when they were 12. Heaven knows what their parents did, right? So the level of education that the steel workers had was minimal. Why did they want a university? Because they saw that education and a university education and the research it would generate, that was the future. That was the future jobs. And Now we've not got a process in Britain of generating future jobs for our own citizens. The strategy is, oh, we've got some future jobs now. Oh dear, we haven't got any workers to do it. Well, we better bring them in from abroad, right? What sort of polity is that, where the solution to skill is always get some foreigners? It's ridiculous. It's a dereliction of the basic concepts of the duty of a government towards its people.
Do you think, I mean, because, I think you've also, in the other context, you've written about how, say, East Germany is an example of where devolution has sort of made a big difference, although there's still some regional disparities. Do you think that that every sort of left behind region of Britain can effectively be sort of leveled up, to use, I guess, a slightly dated phrase? Or do you think there are some regions where we do have to, where it will be a case of managing decline? What are your thoughts on that?
I think uh, if we go to city regions, as I started by saying, the the sensible size for an economic region is something in the range of 5 million up. So, for example, Yorkshire would be a good region. Strong identity, believe me. Um, uh, Combined population of about 5 million. That would be the right level at which to devolve, ideally. At the moment, we've got they're a bit on the small. South Yorkshire's about 2 and a bit million. If we have to live with what we've got, which we may well have to, well, let's make 2.5 million work. It's big enough group, thank God, that it should be possible to generate jobs of the future in such a region. And we know it is possible because one of the things that Sheffield University did was create the Advanced Engineering Manufacturing Centre in Rotherham. Rotherham in the news for being one of the poorest places in England, right? Riots. That was what was. Rotherham shouldn't be identified with riots. This was a place that's been hugely inventive, has this magnificent advanced engineering centre. There's a queue to get into it. This tragedy with that advanced engineering centre is it was planned too small. After only 8 years, it completely filled up, and there's no room to put any other firms in it. At the moment, I went around and talked to firms, and they said, "Oh, we're going to have to move the whole operation to Wales now, because that's where you can get some spare land." Well, that's crazy, foolish lack of planning. If South Yorkshire had had more powers and more confidence, it would have been able to plan because one of the things that the poorer regions have is a lot of land that is spare compared to where I live now, Oxford, where the value of land in Oxford is phenomenally high, ridiculously high. And so there's no room to put anything. So of course we should be planning to put our expansion in the poorer regions, partly so they can catch up, partly because they've actually got the potential to grow because they've got spare land. Anything that Oxford does, it has to involve moving a lot of stuff out.